So, hello everyone, and welcome to today's speaker series event. This is an event organized by the Essex Human Rights Centre and the Essex Armed Conflict and Crisis Hub. And today's talk is on the subject of towards a new approach to national and human security. And our guest speaker, who I'm delighted to consider a friend, and who is also a good friend of the Essex human rights team, and more importantly, is one of today's leading human rights advocates in the US, Hina Shamsi of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. Before I hand over to Hina, just a few background words and why we wanted this subject, and of course why our speaker today is the perfect person to enlighten us in this area. This year marks two important moments in the US. First, we're currently in the early weeks of the Biden-Harris administration, following one of the more dramatic election periods in recent US history. And secondly, later this year, it's going to be 20 years since the attacks of 9/11. And both of these events provide us with a good reason to reflect on issues of human rights and national security in the US. 9/11 was the catalyst for a new approach to counterterrorism, marked not only by concerns over the use of torture and extrajudicial killings, but also a culture of surveillance and direct and indirect discrimination of minorities. And equally, alleged security concerns were at the heart of some of Trump's divisive and dangerous rhetoric and policies early on affecting minorities. And we've also seen the Trump administration continue with some of the other practices that raise concerns from a human rights perspective. And I think as much as we might like to think of President Trump, former President Trump, as an outlier, the reality is that lots of his policies and the events over the last few years can also be seen as points along the same continuum that began with 9/11. And to navigate an exploration of these years and to gain an insight into what we might expect from the new administration, we have, as I mentioned, an absolutely wonderful speaker. Hina Shamsi is the director of the ACLU's National Security Project. This is a project that's dedicated to ensuring that US national security policies and practices are consistent with the Constitution, civil liberties, and human rights. They operate through litigation, advocacy, public education, on matters of discrimination, surveillance, unlawful force, detention, and much more. Hina is also a lecturer in law at Columbia University Law School, has worked also as the acting director of Human Rights First Law and Security Program, and was a senior advisor to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions. So she has a wealth of experience, not only from ACLU, but from other positions and work as well. And so it's with great pleasure, Hina, that I now hand over to you, and the virtual floor is yours. And just to everyone else, just note, Hina will be speaking for probably around 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, just type them up in the Q&A box. Right, we'll be monitoring that box. We won't answer on the spot, but feel free to type up your questions while Hina's speaking, when they pop into your mind. And in the session afterwards, we will do our best to answer as many of the questions as we can. Hina, now the virtual floor really is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Noam, for your kind and generous introduction. The last time I was with you all at Essex was back in June 2017. And I began then, that was a few months after Sir Nigel Rodley had passed. And I began then, because it was so important to begin, by paying tribute to him and what his leadership meant to the human rights movement, including his leadership at Essex. And also what his work and the power of his voice meant to us at the ACLU when he participated in advocacy and litigation against post 9/11 torture by the United States. So I just wanted to again begin by saying we remember him and we honor him. You know, back in 2017, again, when I was with you, we were still at the beginning stages of the Trump presidency, and all of us in this country who work to uphold and defend human rights and civil liberties knew that we had our work cut out for us. You know, in August of last year, before the 2020 election, our legal director did a tally of some of the ACLU's work, and we had filed, it's now over this, but we'd filed 400 legal actions against the Trump administration. That number, I think, represents in some small way, but really pales in comparison to the suffering of people impacted by President Trump's policies at home and abroad. It is hard to tally suffering when the harms and abuses ranged from the Muslim ban and other cruel immigration, refugee, and asylum policies to assaults on voting rights, abortion access, rampant use of the federal death penalty, to continued over-incarceration of prisoners and immigrant detainees during the continuing COVID-19 pandemic. That's just a partial list. I think it's fair to say, and you, Noam, had talked about it being dramatic, that Trump's assault on human rights and civil liberties was and is a particularly dark period in modern American history. Today is the second day of President Trump's second impeachment trial. So the history of the Trump presidency, of course, is still being written, and we're still reckoning with his abuses. But as you said, at the same time, we've already been focused on the Biden-Harris presidency and what President Biden can do to overturn Trump abuses, but also set what Biden referred to last week in his first foreign policy speech as a course correction on US approaches more generally. And there's a lot to do. I'm going to focus today, as the title of my talk indicates, on the necessary work to course correct key issues on national security, which many of us here in the United States are considering as part of a course correction to a more holistic approach to human security. And again, as you said, Noam, in part what Trump has done in this area is continue approaches and abuses that have defined the post-9/11 era. But I think what he also did is make even clearer how harmful, secretive, and unconstrained our executive branch and president can be unless there is that course correction. So let me begin with a little bit of a summary, if it's possible to do that, about the last 20 years of the post-9/11 era, in which this country, my country, invoked extraordinary powers reserved for what should be exceptional, which is war. And it then created a legal and policy framework to facilitate a war-based response, which resulted in a cascade of human rights and law of war violations that have ranged from indefinite detention at the Guantanamo Bay prison to systemic, officially state-sanctioned torture, to domestically special registration programs that targeted people based on religion and national origin, to warrantless surveillance, to discriminatory watch listing, to now seemingly endless conflicts often waged in secretive and unaccountable ways. And that, I think, tries to summarize some of what I'm going to be talking about. But I think also in the last 4 years, a lot has changed. And one important thing that I think we've seen, that we'll see how far it goes, is that there has been some soul searching amongst a number of longtime Democratic national, and I'm talking about the Democratic Party, national security policy leaders who are serving or will serve in the Biden administration, and their recognition, one hopes, that the post-9/11 mentality and legal and policy approaches need to change, that policies relying on militarized tactics as strategic solutions can't be the answer anymore. And I think that there are 3 key lessons to think about as we head into a Biden administration. First is that, and this sort of is in part what President Biden seemed to recognize in his foreign policy speech last week, which is that the consequences of militarized war-based policy approaches are clear when we look at them as a whole, and that they straddle foreign and domestic policy. They violate human rights, damage the rule of law, and this country's reputation. That other nations in a continuingly, increasingly illiberal and authoritarian age aren't just following our country's precedent when it comes to war-based approaches, they're increasingly citing to it. That this country's approaches have fueled conflicts and massive human displacement, with, I think, Yemen as the paradigmatic example. It was a very, very important step, and I give so much credit to Yemeni activists and human rights activists for pushing this. When the US announced its end, the end to its support for Saudi and Yemen, UAE, coalition approaches, but nevertheless, of course, it carved out the US's own direct actions in Yemen. And it's actions like those that have contributed also to militarized approaches, not just abroad, but I think it's important to draw the connections to those approaches at home, with equipment and tactics from America's wars being used in domestic policing, as we saw over the summer's protests back in 2020, those protests for racial justice and against police brutality. And fundamentally, the consequences include that as a policy-making matter, there has been a counterterrorism lens to national security and foreign policy that undercuts and harms diplomatic, humanitarian, rights-promoting approaches that we in this country and in other countries now need to respond to new challenges to our collective human security. I think a second lesson is one that we learned during the Obama years, where so many of these policy approaches that I'm talking about became entrenched. And that lesson is that people with good intentions inside government may accept or defend controversial policies like what used to be called targeted killing, because they view them as exceptional, to be used sparingly with internal procedures to safeguard against abuse. People inside government might think they're following the path of lesser evils, and they may have as an imperative the goal of preserving legal and policy options for presidents to exercise executive power under our domestic legal and constitutional framework. We certainly heard that a lot over the Obama years. The problem, and I think it's important to emphasize this, is that what may be seen as exceptional and necessary in 2002 or 2012 can become entrenched rights violations in 2022. And by 2022, this is all much harder to defend. I think a third lesson, and this one is about the most consequential results. I think the most consequential results of the last 2 decades of war-based policy approaches is that they have destroyed hundreds of thousands of lives, primarily of people who are civilians, Muslim, Black, and Brown. The most direct harm is to people abroad, but I don't think, again, that there can be any doubt about the related domestic consequences when we think about this from a big picture perspective. For 2 decades and more, our government has viewed Muslims, Brown and Black people through a security threat lens and denied or violated fundamental rights in pursuit of counterterrorism and war-based policies. This has fueled bigotry and stigma that entrenches racial divisions and racism. It was all too easy for President Trump to build on this mindset for his attacks on immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers more generally. And what we saw, and I know colleague organizations and activists saw, was that our work to prevent or limit Trump administration abuses was made so much harder because of the legacy left by the Democratic administration that came before him. And I think what's clear to us, and what public opinion, at least here in the United States, increasingly supports, is that a sea change in national security policy, the human security policy, well, that is a racial justice imperative. So when I think about what needs to change and what tests the Biden administration faces, I see some key tests in 3 major interconnected areas. And I'm going to start in the rough chronological order that colleagues and I have sort of been talking about it in, which is the rough chronological order of US abuses and their entrenchment. So the first is, what will Biden do to end continuing indefinite military detention and a broken military trial system at the Guantanamo prison? And I imagine that most of my audience won't need this reminder, but I think it helps to remember that probably just over a year from now, January 11th, 2021, not probably, but definitely, the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay is going to enter its 20th year. There are 40 Muslim men who remain captive there at a cost of $13 million per detainee. 12 of them have been charged in the military commission trial system, including 5 men who've been accused of varying degrees of responsibility for the 9/11 attacks. The 40 men are all either torture survivors or victims of significant similar trauma. They are aging and they have increasingly complex medical conditions that need addressing. Now, during the Bush and Obama administrations, there was a real effort to try and close Guantanamo. President Obama famously declared that he would close it and failed, obviously, to do so. President Trump declared that he would not, in fact, close it and threatened to send more people there. And it was, as these things go, I think probably something of a success that that didn't happen. Closing Guantanamo now is a necessary and critically important part of putting an end to post-9/11 policy approaches. And it's going to require accounting for a number of legal obligations under our Constitution, as well as the Convention Against Torture, and also thinking through for the Biden administration how to pursue justice for the 9/11 attacks, and how to convey a commitment to American ideals that is made more real than merely professed. And I think one of the things that is important to recognize is that after 2 decades, there is no perfect solution for how this can be done. So among the important things that we're going to look to see is whether men who have not been or will not be charged with a crime, whether they will be repatriated or settled to third countries as soon as possible. An easy place to start is with the immediate transfer of 5 detainees who have been approved for transfer for years. And other men who have not or will not be charged should also be transferred expeditiously. And there are ways that we have proposed some very specific steps that can be taken through a periodic review board process that President Obama established to make that happen. Another thing that we're going to look to see, there are ongoing habeas corpus petitions for many of the men who remain detained, and whether the government will continue to oppose those fundamental rights litigation petitions, or whether they will try and work with counsel for detainees to arrive at a fair solution. Whether they might consider plea bargains in the Guantanamo military commissions through a process that would account for the needs of families of victims, as well as fundamental human rights obligations that the United States has. And here in this context, I want to highlight also a couple of cases that have been flying under the radar, but that are very critically important. One, I think in particular, shows how far backwards things went during the Trump administration, and it involves a man named Majid Khan, who was tortured for 3 years at a CIA black site prison before being sent to Guantanamo. He was tortured in really terrible, terrible ways that you can read about. He lived for a long period of time in total darkness. In 2012, Mr. Khan pled guilty in the military commissions, and he's been cooperating with the government ever since. And in the military commission proceedings, there was a process whereby he sought administrative credit against his eventual sentence for the time periods during which our government tortured him while he was in CIA custody and also at Guantanamo. During the Trump administration, and indeed in the waning days of the Trump administration, December 2020, the Trump administration filed a brief with respect to this case, which really was shocking in its rejection of the scope, force, and effect on the United States of international law generally and the prohibition of torture specifically. What the Trump administration argued was that the prohibition of torture is an emerging jus cogens norm, falsely suggesting that the international community has not accepted it as a norm from which no derogation is permitted and which can be modified only by a subsequent international law. I'm just stating the basic tests under international law. But that argument remains as a position of the US government. It is of a piece with the Trump administration's rejection of torture positions, pardoning by President Trump of war criminals. And what the Trump administration does in this case is going to be critically important, and it's still flying under the radar. Another important case, that a set of important cases that we are keeping an eye on, is what the administration will do in the cases of detainees who have argued that the basic guarantee of due process under our Constitution applies at Guantanamo, because 20 years later, it's still being contested. And the Biden administration has the opportunity to agree that the due process clause applies at Guantanamo, not just because that is fundamentally what it should do, but also as a means of arriving at fair resolution and an end to the Guantanamo situation. A second important area is what the Biden administration will do to end secretive and unaccountable use of lethal force abroad. This is an area that, Noam, you and I have talked about for many years. I expect many of the audience will have been following this, but it's important again to note that over multiple administrations, a core component of the United States war-first policy approach has been the policy of secretive and unaccountable killings of people who are suspected, not found by any court, but suspected of involvement in terrorism. This is a policy that over the years has expanded in intensity and geographic scope, and in the categories of people who the US government deems may be killed based on suspicion, alleged association, or affiliation, all without judicial process. Now, during the Obama administration, in response to concerns from US allies, public controversy, advocacy, and litigation, the Obama administration adopted what it called the Presidential Policy Guidance back in 2013. And what that did was to impose certain bureaucratic constraints within the executive branch on what process the executive branch would follow to safeguard against civilian casualties outside of what the administration called areas of active hostilities, which essentially speaking is a synonym for outside recognized armed conflict. Now, that policy contained some meaningful measures, a few of them, such as a preference for capture and a requirement of near certainty that no civilians would be harmed in the locations where the administration deemed that the policy applied. But critically and importantly, in the name of counterterrorism flexibility and threat prevention, the Obama administration ended up entrenching an architecture for a near global government-sponsored killing program with little transparency, no accountability, and no endgame in sight for the precedent that it unleashed or how these expansive powers might ever be reined in. And so if the Biden administration thinks that a form of success of turning back Trump abuses is to go back to Obama standards, that is a mistake. And what we'll be looking to is whether the administration and Congress will abandon the notion of an unbounded war on terror approach against an amorphous set of enemies that essentially overturns, if bypasses and overturns, constraints of international law, even in the wartime context. So we're going to look to see if they will continue to seek a carve-out for counterterrorism lethal strikes, because that exception became policy that became a rule. We're going to look to see whether the Biden administration adheres to law and doctrine of self-defense, the Charter, Article 51, law and doctrine on self-defense, which the Obama administration played fast and loose with, to say the least, and whether it will recognize that wartime rules apply strictly and only in wartime. Another aspect that we're going to, that is going to be an important test, what we've been talking about, many of the things that I've been talking about, especially in this use of force example, is what the administration sees as policy. And I don't think the changes needed go far enough if we think about it only as the policy approach. I think what's also needed is structural change in the ways that these policies work domestically and their interconnection internationally. So what do I mean here? What I mean here is the third major issue, which is related, which is whether the Biden administration will end what is seen in popular parlance as a forever wars approach. We saw reports early on that the Biden administration was going to issue something called a forever wars executive order. It has not done so, and it'll be important to see what, if anything, that includes. It should very much include the measures needed to, put an end to indefinite detention at Guantanamo, end unlawful lethal strikes, but also to reckon with why it is that the administration, multiple administrations, have tended towards this war-based approach and what can be done to rein that in. And here, I think some of the key things are to end operations under two statutory authorities. One is the 2001 Domestic Authorization for Use of Military Force, and the other is the 2002 Authorization for Use of Military Force, which properly was meant to apply only in Iraq. Continued reliance on those two authorizations together has fed nearly 2 decades of mission creep. It has relieved our Congress of its responsibility to take considered, perhaps hard votes regarding military engagements overseas. And it has siphoned resources away from other national priorities, which now include, for example, climate change and responsible measures to address the COVID-19 pandemic. And to give you just one example of how deeply problematic it is that these authorities remain on the books, take the 2002 AUMF, which was used to authorize war against the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq, but which nevertheless successive administrations invoked far beyond that purpose, and which President Trump invoked back in January of last year, which seems like a century ago, but January of last year, as a legal basis for the use of lethal force against an Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, taking the nation at that point, many feared, to the brink of war and escalation there. So in key ways, the record of the last 20 years and the legal and policy approaches remain on the books. And structural reforms that would be needed include, critically, war powers reform in the Congress, because as a domestic law matter, our Constitution invests in Congress the power to declare war, which in the last 30 plus, 50 plus years has been eroded. And there is a movement to rein in war powers, to impose structural reforms through Congress that protects against unilateral executive branch uses of force, and restore a domestic constitutional balance of war powers that is enshrined in the Constitution, and that then has also important consequences and impacts for the use of lethal force abroad and what it means to course correct. So I have thrown out sort of a lot of tests and issues. And I do think, in this area, hard though this work has been for over 20 years, and hard though the administration may feel its choices are, there is, I think, a greater recognition after the Trump years of the need for meaningful course correction, and a far greater appetite for what that would require as this country focuses new challenges that it needs to respond to. And critically importantly, and that's part of why we're talking about, or I'm talking about, shifting from national security to human security, is a recognition that the human rights community and the human rights movement has always known, which is that our rights are interconnected, and that harms to people abroad are connected to harms to people at home. And we need an approach to national security policy that truly recognizes that what is at stake is not only American national security, but a collective approach to our human security. And I think the Biden administration has some real opportunities. Whether it takes advantage of those opportunities remains to be seen, and certainly part of work that my colleagues and so many others here in the United States are engaged on. So I will stop there, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Hina. That was an expansive, clear-eyed, and insightful examination of US policies, past, present, and future. And I think you've helped us connect the dots between the policies, the practices, and the legal actions of the various US administrations over the years. So thank you for that. A reminder to all of our audience, you can put questions in the Q&A. I'll read out the questions to Hina. I'll also name the people who are asking the questions. If you don't want your name, then just ask it anonymously. Before we get to the first question that's there, Hina, I'll invoke the chair's prerogative, and I have a couple of points I'd like to raise with you myself. During the Obama presidency, you and colleagues helped us all with some occasional, shall we call it, myth busting regarding the Obama administration's human rights record. I think when he was first elected, there were lots of people, particularly in the human rights world, that seemed to forget that he ran for and was elected as president of the US, not as president of Amnesty International, and expectations were maybe a little too high in that sense. And I think with time, human rights-based criticism of Obama seemed to grow. For example, on use of force abroad and drone strikes and so on. I wonder if 4 years of Trump make you see Obama any differently, in that sense, or not? Just a question here.
Well, no, one thing that you said, I for one would love it if a president of Amnesty International became president of the United States. So that feels important to start off with. In this area that we're talking about, US national security policy, no, I don't see President Obama differently. In fact, what in some sense characterized the Obama administration approach of, a verbal commitment to the rule of law and human rights and the law of war that was accompanied by a level of hand-wringing, and we're reluctant, but we have to do these things that involve counterterrorism strikes, the failure to move forward quickly enough at Guantanamo, the failure to set an initially intransigent Defense Department bureaucracy on the right course with respect to Guantanamo, defending legal positions to justify indefinite military detention, continue a broken military commission, prevent transparency about lethal force policies. It was only after we and the New York Times sued to obtain the presidential policy guidance that it was made public. And so I think that was an administration that said, we're good people, we reluctantly have to do these things. And in taking that approach, entrenched the very frameworks that Trump then came in and abused even more with greater secrecy, so that the course correction that I'm hoping Biden is talking about is a course correction not just of the Trump presidency, but of the Obama and Bush presidencies that came before it.
Thanks. Yeah, I suspected you might say that, but I thought it would be useful for everyone to hear. So there are a couple of questions relating specifically to Guantanamo and detention issues. Carolyn Hamilton is asking, how does the US continue to justify the non-trial of charged detainees, given that they would be tried before a military tribunal? Why not press ahead with tribunals? What's the reason behind it?
Yeah, so I think, the history of the military commissions is a history of what happens when you press ahead with military tribunals. starting back in the early 2000s, there were various iterations of what those tribunals look like. And I think that what's important to sort of recognize about why those tribunals have been a failure and why it really is inconceivable that a fix is possible in the military commission system, you have to go back to the fact that it's a combination of how successive administrations have dealt with the fact that torture was used on the detainees, and that they refused to use federal criminal legal processes instead of a rights violating and then watered down rights violating military framework. The reason that I think the reason that the tribunals continue to stutter along boils down to this, that they are untested. The rules for the tribunals, which are rules in capital death penalty cases, do not meet fair trial standards, that the use of torture and torture evidence is still at the heart of how these tribunals can or will function, that defense lawyers are still being denied access to important information about what was done to their clients, that every step along the way has to be litigated because 20 years later, this is still a made-up system with that administrations have attempted to regularize, but that still has fundamental questions at the heart of it. And so I think it is generally understood now in the United States. There are a few, diehards. Senator Lindsey Graham can always be relied on for this opinion, which is, I think, was martialized even when it was most vociferously voiced. The military commissions are a failure. They are broken. They are not a means of arriving at a just outcome for anyone, including the families. And so the question becomes, what does the Biden administration do?
Okay, thanks. And then a follow-on detention-related question from Mara Revkin. So in addition to closing Guantanamo, what are your recommendations for the Biden-Harris administration with regard to military involvement in interrogation of detainees at secret prisons in Yemen, if that's still happening, and more generally on cooperating with or tolerating human rights violations by partner militaries?
Yeah. Hi, Mara, and thank you so much for that question. So I don't think anyone got a satisfactory answer after those 2017 reports about what was happening with US involvement with Emirati torture of Yemeni detainees in that secret prison network. Really important work done by the Associated Press to reveal those abuses, and I urge anyone who hasn't seen that to go back and look at those. We, and I'm sure others, filed Freedom of Information Act requests for greater information and advocated with respect to that. Never got a satisfactory response or a meaningful response. So I think that's one area of cleanup. And it certainly looked like, based on very, very credible accounts, that the US was feeding information to Emiratis and obtaining information and benefiting from that torture, which goes without saying, fundamental human rights violation. I think there's some important lessons learned, not only from that, but also from what the Bush administration was doing with partner forces and proxy forces, and what the Trump administration continued to do. And so in response to your question, Mara, I think one critical area that communities and rights activists have been focused on is no support for partner forces that engage in torture and unlawful killing. And an area of concern is whether the Biden administration will rely, in the name of counterterrorism, more on proxy forces and the partner forces that are an increasingly important part of post-9/11 US approaches, whether that's in Afghanistan or elsewhere, and what they will do. Again, there are a number of very specific recommendations about not supporting or engaging with partner forces, about the kinds of training that needs to be done with respect to partner forces, and critically, all they need to do is learn from history and not repeat the mistakes of the past in worse form. It's not that the work hasn't been done. The question is how work hasn't been done to say what needs to be done with respect to partner forces and proxy forces. It's what will they do and what carve-outs might they seek to retain, even as they grapple with ending a forever wars-based approach to US policy.
Thanks. There's a question from Dominic Millward Stone, and I'll add something of my own to that. So the question is, what approach could effectively be used aside from the military approach to safeguard both human rights, the rule of law, and effective prevention of terrorist activities collectively? And I suppose I'd add to that the link to just a general question of what you would expect from the Biden administration with regard to foreign policy and intervention, and should the US be playing a global policing role in that sense?
It's very tempting in these Q&As, Dome, to sort of turn to you and say, well, what do you think, No? So I may just do that. And to Dominic's important question, if I may call you Dominic, I think multiple things. So one myth, talking about myth busting, Noam, is this sort of view, and I think part of the danger of it becoming entrenched after 20 years is this sort of myth that there is either a military approach or nothing, right? And between those extreme dynamics, which can too often consume public discourse, is the recognition that the military war-based approach has got to be exceptional. And instead, it has become a norm and a policy driver. There are multiple other approaches that can include the use of law enforcement techniques, investigations, and prosecutions, working with governments to responsibly consider legal ways of extradition or feasibility of capture for those truly exceptional situations, to empowerment of communities and countries to address security situations themselves. So, another thing that, I didn't touch upon, but part of the approach that the US has taken for communities and development, again, is a counterterrorism approach, right? And I'm thinking here about countering violent extremism policies, which over a course of multiple years and hundreds of millions of dollars involved State Department and other agencies invoking and applying a counterterrorism threat-based approach in multiple parts of the world that directed development and humanitarian funds in support of a counterterrorism policy driver. In multiple parts of the world, what that did was entrench authoritarian leaders who used US counterterrorism, national security type arguments against their own populations, marginalized Muslim communities where those were minority communities within those populations. Kenya is a prominent example there. And so a responsible approach is one that does not view human rights, humanitarian, diplomatic policies through counterterrorism as the driver. But instead, you can think of public health approaches. You can think of rights promoting approaches instead of rights circumventing approaches. There, again, is important work that has been done amongst humanitarian agencies, diplomats and former diplomats about what this might look like. What it shouldn't look like is the war-based approach of the last 20 years.
Thanks, and I'd add to that because you were asking what.
Yes, what would Noam do?
My thoughts on this. I mean, in a way, I find, and sort of working in the, particularly in the sort of humanitarian law field, it's almost sometimes an easy way out because sort of the question I focus on is something lawful or not? But at the same time, lawful doesn't mean wise. Lawful doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do, and there are often things that I'll end up saying, well, yeah, they're allowed to do that. I don't think they should, but they're allowed to. And those are two very separate questions. I think in sort of, if we're talking about, and your talk was very much sort of starting with the 9/11. I think Afghanistan, Iraq, the questions of counterterrorism were bound so tightly with mixing issues of humanitarian intervention. We're doing this for the people, together with we're protecting the US, together everything was mixed, and depending where you stood on some of these things, you picked the argument that you wanted to support or criticize certain actions. And I wonder sort of the things that have happened in the intervening years and how that might affect Biden's choices in these matters. If you look at sort of Syria, and in particular Syria and Libya, and the effect of intervention in Libya, which somehow sort of fallen off the news radar, even though clearly it's still a horrific situation there, and depending again where you stand, the intervention or non-intervention in Syria, because there has been some, but not to the extent that others would have liked to see, and how well that has or hasn't worked. I think my sense is going to color Biden's approach to sort of global use of force and counterterrorism in a way that perhaps it will be different to the Obama years because of that experience in more recent conflicts. I'm not sure if you'd agree with that, but I'm curious to see, precisely because of these developments and changes from the Obama years, Libya and Syria in particular. I'm curious. Obviously, some of those started out in Obama's time, but the way things have developed over the last few years, I'm curious to see whether that might mean that Biden takes a very different course of action. Not sure. Back to you.
Yeah, I think I remember reading, and memory is another thing that is a little challenged in the post-Trump period. But one of the regrets of Obama and his presidency was what happened in Libya, and the this goes back in time, but the legal contortions that State Department and other personnel went into to justify intervention in Libya as a domestic law matter and an international law matter. And when I say legal contortions, I am being overly kind. The human and policy outcome of that, devastating. And Syria, you're right, it was more limited to some extent, but the legal claims and the legal theories, virtually no limit. And so what we're talking about here is, in many ways, a one-way trajectory of war-based approaches. I think those are two illustrations of the point that I'm trying to make. And also a failure on the two main parts of US government that are supposed to interact and constrain these powers, right? Both the presidency and Congress. And it is a terrible political dynamic when Congress does not engage responsibly in those kinds of decisions. So here, it seems to me, President Biden, to state the obvious, comes out of the Senate. Institutions are important to him. And in the long term, for basic structural change, in the immediate term, structural reform so that these decisions of the power to go to war and kill and possibly cause more devastation, even when your intentions might be good at the outset. What will our two branches of government do about that? Because our third branch of government, the courts, the presidency has tried to keep out of weighing in on these kinds of questions. I don't have a perfect, glib answer for you here, Noam. I think it's a hard one, but I think there has not been enough done for most of the past 20 years to grapple with how to address those questions from a perspective of humanitarian improvement rather than war-based immediate term solutions. Does that sort of answer?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there is a perfect answer. These are questions that it's not only the US that's grappling with, of course. You mentioned institutions, and looking at it from the outside, it seemed that one of the more damaging actions of Trump during his presidency years was the erosion of the professional ranks in public service. Because of particular actions that he took or because of people leaving, but all sorts of reasons. And I wondered, as to your perspective on the extent to which this has happened, if it's politicization or other problems that have arisen, but within the intelligence agencies, and whether sort of damage has been done to the intelligence agencies in the last 4 years that can be fixed quickly or not, and how that's affected human rights issues.
Yeah. So I think a couple of things there. It has been heartening to see really some very, very good people appointed to positions in the Biden administration, including colleagues, and I'm not just talking about national security, but immigration and other areas, people who have done good and important work promoting rights promoting approaches to difficult questions. So I think that that is obviously a very, very good thing. Another good thing is that I think the Biden administration has learned lessons from what happened at the beginning of the Obama administration, where policy people were left in positions and taking positions that committed, arguably, an Obama administration to directions it might not have wanted to go in. I think for the Biden administration, it was made obviously so much harder when Trump continued contesting the election, and the Biden administration did not have access transition-wise, as has been normal, in the past. So that sort of cleaning house with respect to Trump policy people is important, and they've taken some pretty important steps along the way. With respect to the intelligence agencies, I think, again, remains to be seen. And it has been rather an interesting dynamic to watch over the last 4 years, intelligence agencies that, in the course of our work, involved in so many abuses, seen by people as under attack under Trump, and they were, trying to grapple with norms and norm support. And here I want to come to something concrete and particular, because I think a lot of this sort of remains still to be seen, which is that, we have a number of areas or agencies of focus in our work at the ACLU, among them the CIA, the FBI, and NSA. It was yet another deviation, yet in some ways a culmination of the US's history with torture, that Trump would appoint Gina Haspel to the director of the CIA. To me, it was a sign of how pervasive the corruption of torture can be, that a person who was a senior CIA official who oversaw torture at a CIA black site and then later participated in the destruction of torture evidence, became promoted by the CIA as part of what it admitted was an unprecedented campaign to support her political nomination domestically. And she's, obviously not going to be CIA director anymore, but over and over again, we see reports of people who remain in the bureaucracy, who supported torture, who defended torture, who faced no meaningful consequences and instead get promoted. So part of what it comes back to for me is there's a lot of cleanup that needs to be done, not just in law, policy, framework, and also personnel. And famously, by the end of the Obama administration, that administration was devoted to looking forward, not backwards. And we unfortunately haven't had the luxury, because you have to keep looking backwards when people like Gina Haspel were promoted to CIA director. So what will they do to address that also, I would argue, politicization of the intelligence agency to support torture and carry it out?
Thanks. I think we've reached the end of the questions to be asked. So I don't know if there's anything general that you want to add in closing, Hina?
Well, I mean, I have a question for you because, you know, these are also areas of, yeah, wait, we didn't talk about this. You know, these are areas you've also worked on. And, you know, among the things that we've all engaged in or been worried about are what are the UK doing with respect to, you know, lethal force policy, and Australia and others. And I know you're not in the business of prediction, but how do you see from your perch these issues developing or moving?
I mean, I think to a certain extent, I'm curious. In a way, it's less prediction, more curiosity, right? To see if the UK and other countries return to a let's follow the US lead position, which in many ways used to be the case, and for the last 4 years that was weakened to a certain extent. So I'm very curious about that. In terms of use of force, that I think was very much the case in the past. So I think a lot of it's going to depend on what the Biden administration does in this regard, whether it sort of gets back to sort of more interventionist use of force and goes back to Obama days in terms of also, you know, the drone strikes and so on. But I think the legal discourse has changed around this as well in recent years. So, as you said, I don't like making predictions, but I think the big one really is just I think we're likely to see a return to follow your lead on most of these issues. I was going to get into some more legal issues here, but then I think that'll open us up to a longer discussion, and we've promised the audience that we're wrapping up. So you and I can continue afterwards.
You do, yes.
But Hina, I want to thank you on behalf of the Human Rights Centre and the Essex Armed Conflict and Crisis Hub, and I know a number of colleagues also and the students have been on the call for this. So on behalf of everyone and everyone else who's joined us, I just want to say thanks for a real tour de force of lessons learned from the past 20 years and some good strategic advice on where we need to focus our efforts moving forwards. So thank you so much. And we will be bringing you back again for more talks at Essex whenever we can, because it's just always great to hear from you. So thank you, and I'll let Katia or Sophie, who are running this, do the ending this. I'm not sure how this quite works, if they just click a button. But thank you to everyone who's been watching. If you want to come back to this, then it's going to be posted, I believe, live on the well, it's on live now, but it's going to be posted on the YouTube channel of the Human Rights Centre. So thank you to everyone for joining us, and hopefully see you